Good morning. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study here at Harvard. And I am so proud to stand here before you as the Dean of this wonderful institute on Radcliffe Day 2019, my inaugural Radcliffe Day as Dean. I'm also delighted that my first year at the helm of the Institute culminates in this program, honoring a woman who is my personal hero, a visionary leader, and a legendary civil rights and labor activist, Dolores Huerta. Dolores is truly a woman who illustrates the point that Chancellor Merkel made yesterday during the commencement exercises, that everything is possible. It's our aim this Radcliffe Day to celebrate Dolores and also to call attention to the centrality of civic engagement to a healthy democratic society and to securing equity and opportunity for all. Today, we'll hear from Dolores as she reflects on more than 60 years of fighting for justice and as she looks ahead at the work that remains to be done to achieve full equality and dignity for the poor and the marginalized. This afternoon, Dolores will engage in conversation with Soledad O'Brien, the esteemed journalist, author, and philanthropist, and Radcliffe College alumna. Yes. Soledad is the founder and CEO of Starfish Media Group, as well as the anchor and producer of the program Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien. She has appeared as anchor and reporter on all three broadcast networks, as well as on CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and Al Jazeera. Soledad is working on a documentary addressing the issue of food insecurity on college campuses across the United States. And so she is, we thought, the perfect moderator for today's program. Food insecurity among college students is symptomatic of deep and multifaceted challenges within this country's food system. The USDA estimates that 12% of US households experienced food insecurity over the course of 2017, the most recent year for which we have statistics. Now, this is down from a high of 15% in 2011, and yet still higher than in the immediate years leading up to the Great Recession of 2008. Households with children, single-parent households, and households with racial and ethnic minorities are even more likely to be food insecure. That this level of food insecurity exists and persists alongside historically low unemployment and globally unprecedented food abundance should give us pause. Meanwhile, the very abundance has been linked to ongoing environmental degradation, and our country faces an obesity epidemic that adversely affects health and costs roughly $150 billion per year in direct medical costs alone. Moreover, the workers who produce our food often labor under inhumane conditions. Our medalist has struggled against this manifest injustice since the late 1950s. Speaking on a university campus in 1974, Dolores implored her audience, saying, quote, "You have a responsibility to farm workers because the farm workers feed you. And when people say to you that they don't want to walk for justice, remind them that a farm worker has to walk thousands of miles in his lifetime to feed you, to put food on your table." Now, despite some progress over the intervening decades, let me dispel any illusion that all is well among agricultural laborers and their families. Farm workers continue to be among the most vulnerable in our country. And so we begin today with a panel that aims to unpack these systemic issues and grapple with a key question. How can we create a food system that ensures just labor practices, as well as access to ethical, sustainable, and healthy food? Soledad will moderate the discussion, and she's joined by a distinguished panel of experts and activists whose work engages the food system from distinct perspectives. I'm grateful to each of our panelists for joining us today. In a moment, Soledad will introduce them, and then they'll share brief framing remarks, followed by a discussion. Before the panel begins, let me call your attention to a Radcliffe Day first, one that we're very proud of. In addition to the programming here on stage, we're spotlighting a number of organizations engaged in service and research at the intersection of food and justice. Inspiring individuals and organizations are here in our marketplace of ideas, located in the Sunken Garden, to share their work and their expertise with you. If you didn't have a chance to visit the marketplace this morning, you'll have another opportunity during the hour-long break following the panel, which will start at 11:30, the break. I hope you'll take a minute to engage these experts and organizations as we all consider how we can personally move towards the critical work of pursuing a just and equitable food system. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Soledad O'Brien and the panel. Please join me in warmly welcoming them to the stage.
So you'll be in. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So over the next little over an hour, we're going to have an opportunity to talk to real experts, people who are scholars, lawyers, activists, public health experts, officials, authors, really just invested very much in this issue of food and justice. And that, of course, includes workers' rights. How do we feed all of America? And why is so much of what we eat unhealthy? I happen to be in the middle of a documentary right now that looks at students who are food insecure, and so this was one of the reasons that when I was asked to be on this panel, I was like, well, this could be very good timing for me. We know, of course, that colleges have, the profile of the college student has changed. Many students who are now attending college are poor. Their whole entire families are poor. School, obviously, is expensive, and food sometimes is just an option. Many schools look at it that way. There are policies, in fact, that could help students that just don't because of the way they are structured. And so for me, questions about social justice have always been very interesting. College students know that they need an education if they hope to have a career, not just a job, but a career, but they're also then sucked under by the very thing that they need, which is an education and the cost of that. And so what I have found most intriguing and maybe astounding is that so many people are just utterly disconnected to the plight of these students. We definitely have a world of haves and have-nots. When I was in college, food was not anything you thought about. You had a dining hall, it all served up a meal, the same meal basically to everybody. And even when I was in high school, public school in Long Island, the number of students who were struggling with food insecurity was actually quite low. New data, of course, would show us that among students that number is high and continues to grow. How do we have a food insecurity problem in America? Not just pockets of America, but now all across this nation. And this has been my interest in exploring policies and the connection to food, and also people's connections, of course, to policies, and ultimately what are those solutions. People often talk about solutions and say things like we have an amazing food pantry, which I think is a terrible solution. I think it's a great thing, but I also think if your solution to food insecurity is a pantry, you might be missing the plot a little bit. And so I am thrilled to moderate this conversation and to introduce to you our panelists. And I'm going to ask each one to talk to you for a few minutes about how they see this issue, kind of where they come from and their point of view, and why they wanted to be part of this discussion. And then after we get all of our panelists to do that for a few minutes apiece, then we'll begin the moderated portion of our conversation. And so, our panelists. We'll begin with health policy expert and Harvard Public Health professor, Sara Bleich. She's a far distance from me. Next to her is Jennifer Gordon, immigration and employment activist, lawyer, and professor of law. A writer, activist, Food First co-founder, Moore Lappé is next to her. I love that she's taking notes. Frances, I want to know what you're taking notes on. You know, I'm just teasing you. And an agriculture and economic policy expert, Daniel Sumner, is next to her. And renowned chef and food activist, Alice Waters, is here next to me. So first, we'll begin with a big round of applause for our panelists. And then Sara, will you kick it off for us, please?
Yeah, so thank you, Soledad. It's a pleasure to be here. So I come at this topic of food injustice from a health policy perspective. And so what's most interesting to me is thinking about how do aspects of our food system affect our health and our well-being. And from where I sit, there are a number of reasons that we should be concerned, but there are also a number of effective policies out there that can actually help address some of the shortcomings of the food system. But let me start with where I'm particularly concerned. So first thing that we should all be very aware of is that in the United States, food is incredibly inexpensive, and it is the cheapest food that tends to be worse for us. So it's higher in fat, it's higher in sugar, it's higher in calories, and it's also the case that food is everywhere and it's heavily marketed to us. And it's these characteristics of the food system, along with many others, that are driving us to eat too much. And eating too much and poor diet in general is responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths each year in the United States, from things like heart disease and hypertension. And it's also the case that eating too much is fueling the obesity epidemic that Tamika was just talking about. So just over the past 3 decades, obesity has doubled among adults, it's tripled among adolescents, or it's tripled among children and quadrupled among adolescents. And I am particularly interested in low-income and vulnerable populations because I come from inner-city Baltimore and I get what it means to live in neighborhoods where you don't have good access to healthy food. But the good news is that overeating and eating unhealthy foods is a totally preventable problem. And so what I want to take a few minutes and talk to you about is what are some policies that seem to be working and what's an area where we really need to see more progress. So one policy at the federal level that shows some promise is menu labeling. And so menu labeling was included in the 2010 Affordable Care Act, which many of you probably know as Obamacare. And what it said is that if you're a large chain restaurant, you have to post calories alongside price. And many other food establishments are also required to post this information, with the idea being that if you put calories in the public space, people will buy less of them, or they'll buy healthier items. Well, 60 or so studies have looked at this question of does menu labeling impact consumer behavior? And what they overwhelmingly show is maybe a little, not that much. There might be some action in cafeterias and coffee shops, but it's not a strong signal. But the story of menu labeling appears to be not that you and I make different decisions at the point of purchase. It appears to be that restaurants are reformulating their menus. And by reformulating their menus, they're dropping the highest calorie items off the menu, and they're introducing new items with lower calories. Now that's important because it does not require you and I to make decisions. It is changing the broader environment around us. And that is how you make sustainable changes around population health. And then a second example is beverage taxes. Now, there is no single thing that we can throw at this problem of us eating too much and having poor diets that's going to fix it. But if I could be queen for a day, we would have more beverage taxes. And so right now, there are 7 localities around the country that have beverage taxes. Philadelphia has a beverage tax that passed on January 1st, 2017, or that was implemented then. And the story from a public health perspective is very positive. And so it's a 1.5 cents per ounce tax. It's on sugar-sweetened drinks like Coke and artificially sweetened drinks like Diet Coke. And what we just looked at, we just did a study looking at the impact of the tax on volume sales. And so after the first year, there was nearly a 40% drop in volume sales of taxed beverages inside Philadelphia. That is equivalent to people purchasing 83 million fewer cans of soda. That is a huge public health win. But the added benefit is also that the money that's raised by the taxes, which is significant, Philadelphia was estimated to raise about 91 million in the first year, and they came within about 10% of that. That money is being funneled back into communities in things like universal pre-K and green space and community schools. So it's a real policy win-win and something that I think we should look to for more activity in that area. Now there's one particular policy area where I think that we need to see more action. If menu labeling and beverage tax are two areas of success, one where we need more attention is a program called SNAP, and that stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Many of you probably know it as food stamps. Among our federal safety net that's designed to help promote nutrition and help low-income families, SNAP is by far the largest. It helps about 40 million Americans afford food each month, and about half of them are children. And then the budget for the program is $65 billion. And so historically, SNAP has had this focus on lifting families out of poverty and reducing food insecurity, two really important goals, and it's done them well. But it has a secondary focus on public health, and where I think we can make a lot of progress in thinking about addressing the shortcomings of the food system is really trying to help put more public health into the SNAP program. And so just one specific example to give you is around the country, there are about 250,000 stores that are authorized to accept those roughly $65 billion in SNAP benefits. And if you're a beneficiary, you can take your SNAP card, like an ATM card, and you can purchase just about anything in a store except for tobacco and alcohol and toilet paper, for example. So a reasonable question is, well, should you be able to buy soda with your SNAP benefit card? And there are extremely strong views on both sides of this question, but it's something that we should really be thinking about, because if there were to be policy changes like this to improve the public health impact of the program, the scope and reach mean that it could really have a huge impact on lives, particularly of low-income Americans. And so I just want to leave you with sort of two main points from a health policy perspective. The first is that individual changes that you and I can make are simply not sufficient to overcome the shortcomings of the food system. Rather, we have to change the broader environment to bring down the barriers to eating healthy food and raise up the barriers to eating unhealthy food. And the second is that lower income groups and vulnerable populations are disproportionately affected by the shortcomings of the food system. And so if we focus on risk factors like sugary beverage consumption and things that are disproportionate among vulnerable groups, then if we're able to make changes in those areas, it can actually really push forward changes in population health by improving health equity. Thank you.
So I began my career working for workers' rights as a volunteer at the Hotel Workers Union here in Boston. In the 1980s, I was still in school, and one day I came into the office, and on a table next to a garbage can was a piece of paper that somebody had torn out of a pad, and on top of the paper was sitting, clearly taken out of the garbage can, the stems of a bunch of grapes with little bits of skin attached, and scrawled on the piece of paper was, "Who the fuck is eating grapes?" And that, to me, was an early and incredibly important lesson in the fierceness of workers fighting for justice, in the United Farm Workers, which 20 years before I saw that piece of paper had started a grape boycott, that 20 years later, across the country and in a union of hotel workers, was still a religion. It wasn't a belief, it was a religion. And for me, the ability to see that religion as the lifeblood of a life, as a motivating force, was something that moved me forward into the next 30 years of working with migrant and immigrant workers and other low-wage workers of color to fight for their rights to dignity on the job. Now, I wish I could say that the fierce attention to the cause of farm workers that I saw in the 1980s in Boston continued through the 90s and into the 2000s. Certainly the United Farm Workers continued their important work. But as to food, the public's attention drifted. And it didn't drift in a bad place. It drifted toward slow food and organic food and artisanal food and Instagrammable food. And there was justice in there, right? There was attention particularly and importantly to the environmental impacts of food and to cruelty to animals, and something that we needed to address as we ate, and to the importance of growing food locally and knowing our producers. But somehow the workers fell off the radar screen a bit. And I think this is starting to change. And I want to talk a little bit about how and why and some things I see working. So one of the keys to the ongoing work for workers' rights and food workers' rights has been, over the past few decades, to really understand systemically what's going on with the food system that causes workers who sow the food and pick the food and package it and serve it to us in restaurants and wash the dishes afterwards to be so poorly paid and so badly treated. And part of that recognition these days is that food, for the most part, is not that different than Nike sneakers or a Gap t-shirt. That is to say, we have brands at the top selling us the food, and they are subcontracting down the production of that food to where it can be done most cheaply. And cheap here is a synonym for treating workers badly, where it can be done with least respect for workers' rights to a decent job and a dignified life. And one of what I see as one of the most key insights of the worker justice movement in food today is that when the economic structure changes, our strategies have to change also. And an illustration of that for me comes from an organization I admire a lot called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is based in Immokalee, Florida, and works with the Guatemalan and Mexican and Haitian farm workers who pick 90% of this country's winter tomatoes that grow in Florida. And they started, actually, I know about them because in 1991, I was working in Florida, and the people who would go on to found the coalition were also working there. I would go off and start an immigrant workers organizing center in New York, and they started the coalition. And their goal was to improve conditions for farm workers in Immokalee. And what they first started was protesting, picketing, whenever a farmer or a contractor treated workers badly. And what they learned very quickly was it wasn't the contractors making the bulk of the decisions. Sure, there were bad apples, but the farm workers were embedded in a structure where they had to bid to have their products bought by the brands and the restaurants, the chains that sold the food. And so who was setting the prices and conditions? It was McDonald's, it was Walmart, and so on. And so what they did over the 20 years that came after that was build a movement of workers, but also students and churches and mosques and temples, and of believers in the good food movement itself, to put pressure on brands at the top. And what they pressed them to do was to agree to standards that the farm workers themselves had set. So an end to sexual harassment in the field, an end to contractors demanding that instead of handing over a bucket that was full to the top, that the workers hand over a bucket that was double full and mounded. and so on. And one of the most important things they demanded was that the brands pay a penny more per pound of tomatoes, just a penny. And over the past 20 years, pushing the brands at the top, they have gotten Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell, Walmart, Aramark, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's to agree that they will not do business with contractors that do not adhere to those standards. And among other things, the result in just 5 years since they've launched their program with the brand agreement has been $30 million more in farm workers' pockets. And so I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to leave you with that as an image of what's possible in terms of justice for workers who make our food available to us, and also with the hope that we'll see a lot more of it in the years to come.
Thanks. Frances?
Okay, I've learned so much already. Great. Soon after Diet for a Small Planet in 1971, I summed up my message this way. Hunger is not caused by scarcity of food, it's caused by scarcity of democracy. And I got that out. But I could hear my audience also thinking, that's a nice soundbite, lady, but what kind of democracy can actually end hunger? And so, for all these decades, I have been searching for answers. And among those who I'm grateful for are our founders, who got it on some level, insisting that for democracy, you have to have citizens with an independent voice, and that meant they had to have an economic stake so that they would not be dependent and vulnerable to tyranny. And so Alexander Hamilton said, power over a man's subsistence, food, is power over his will. And John Adams, monopolized property is a curse to mankind. Equal liberty requires every member of society to own land, in other words, to have a stake. So, what I think it's easy to forget, even though, an elder like me who lived through this time, not long ago, from the 40s to the 70s, we were moving toward more equal liberty. Never got there, but we're moving in that direction, where everyone has a stake. Real family income during my youth, from the 40s to the 70s, real family income in America doubled. And you know who gained the most? The poorest among us. And then it changed, tragically changed, so that now we've seen wealth rushing to the top. Now 3 Americans control more wealth than the bottom half of us put together. Most of us live paycheck to paycheck. So its impact on food and farming, I just want to make 5 quick bullets before I move to solutions. And first, that, as many of you know, 1 in 8 of us is now labeled food insecure, which is a nice way of talking about not knowing if you can get enough to eat. But what most grabs my heart is that half of all babies born in America today are dependent on public aid to eat. The world's largest seed and pesticide company, now Bayer Monsanto, could for 2 decades suppress the health risks of its products. And only now, with 13,000 lawsuits, maybe there's some pushback. 3, farmland continues to move into ever fewer hands. I just saw this, that 5 white men control more land than 33,000 African American landowners. 4, even farmers with title to their land lack independence. For example, 3 corporate chicken giants control 90% of the market, and they dictate the terms. And on climate, yes, our climate crisis, U.S. Ag is a contributor, and just since 1990, that contribution has grown 16%. And in all of this, perhaps, our farm workers are among the most hurt. My daughter Anna and I visited a farm worker camp a number of years ago, and I'll never forget this woman. Dying of cancer, her children were playing in the field. playing in the yard, and she said to us with no bitterness in her voice, she said, "I don't understand. We provide your food. Why don't you respect us?" So, at the very same time, of course, to all these bullets, we know about climate-friendly, regenerative farming and all the good things we're talking about here. So why aren't they taking off? And my answer is back to where I began almost 50 years ago. Our democracy is broken. So here's my takeaway. All of us passionate about food and justice, food justice, can enlarge our identity even more. I know that for myself, once I finished World Hunger 10 Myths a few years ago and I was struggling to grab the root, democracy, a friend of mine looked me in the eyes and said, "Frankie, don't you know that you can love 2 children at once?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I got 2 kids. I think I got that idea." Food and democracy, and of course it helps that my actual daughter is actually a leader in the food movement, in the real food media work. But I can love the food movement and the democracy movement because I know that only with accountable democracy can real solutions emerge to all these questions that are confronting us in this crisis-ridden world. So the great news I want to share with you is that there is a democracy movement now emerging. It is historic. And whatever primary passion we have, we can go to this route and fight against, with the democracy movement as part of it, against voter suppression, against gerrymandering, against money's grip on politics. And in the fall midterms, across the country, 18 democracy reform initiatives along these lines passed. And they're foundational. And also, in the coming presidential election, there are candidates who are identifying some root issues here related to food and farming. Warren, for example, calls for trust busting in agriculture and an end to abusive contract farming. Sanders' plans would target subsidies to farmers who most need it and hold CAFOs accountable for pollution. So we can love 2 children at once, knowing that by advancing the democracy movement, we're also advancing the food justice and sustainability movement. So to help all of us, do both, we at Small Planet Institute are, with the Democracy Initiative, starting a portal online. It will be launched soon at democracymovement.us, where whatever passion you have, you can go there and also weigh in for democracy. And among our partners groups, there are 70 groups that shows you the range representing 40 million people. They range from NAACP to Food and Water Watch and Greenpeace, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all people loving 2 children at once. So we can make connections we've never made before because in this do or die moment, we have to become more effective than we ever have been before. And I'll close with this note. It's very important. You don't have to be an optimist. You don't have to be an optimist because maybe that's too hard right now. But we can be possibilists. I mean that in our connected world of continuous change, it is simply not possible to know what's possible. Who, in 1955, when you, Dolores Huerta, when you began organizing, who could have predicted that you would go on to co-found UFW, endure multiple arrests, police brutality, and wake up America to the plight of farm workers and improve the lives of millions? You, Dolores Huerta, enabled me to be a possibilist, a dyed-in-the-wool possibilist. Thank you, thank you.
So I want to start simply by saying thank you for letting me be a part of this distinguished panel and to be a part of honoring Ms. Huerta, who's with us. It's a thrill for me to be here. What I can contribute is talking about economics. That's all I know how to talk about, so stick with. I got to agricultural economics probably when I was 3 years old or earlier. I grew up on a small farm in California, halfway between Berkeley and Davis, if you're an academic. My father was a local high school agriculture teacher, and our farm grew apricots, peaches, pears, and prunes, quite common at the time to have lots of crops. And I learned very early that what drove the agriculture I knew was the economics of that agriculture. That's what kept people working, what kept jobs there, what kept the land in production. What I want to talk about today is to go back to the farm worker issues very specifically. And I want to tie it also to some of the consumer issues that are also have been brought up here, because I think despite progress and really remarkable success in awareness of farm worker issues over many decades, the fact is farm workers are poor. Almost all are immigrants. Almost all are living on at or very near poverty levels, and that's all over the United States. I'm very familiar with the situations in California, and that's at the same time that we are in a food abundant world in some senses. Hired farm workers are primarily devoted to a handful of crops and livestock products. That is to say, the ratio of output or output value to hired farm work is quite low when you get to corn or soybeans, the sort of things that you think of in the Midwest, and much higher when you get to Florida or especially California. We recently did a few calculations. They're the sort of things you can dig out of the data. My research center at UC Davis does a lot of work on farm costs and returns across everything from alfalfa and asparagus to zucchini and everything in between. If you look at the farm labor share, this is the earnings of farm workers as a share of the cost of production, that ranges from a few percent for machine harvested and planted crops to maybe 10% for dairy, 15% for organic dairy, up to 30 or 40% for fruits and vegetables, many of them, over 50% for canned peaches. This is the farm share of the farm costs. If you then ask, what's the share of the farm cost in the retail price, that also varies a lot. But for the sorts of, for milk, for example, for a gallon of milk, that farm cost is about 50%. For organic milk, it's about 30%. So the margin between the farm and the retail is much higher for organic milk. And that varies across products. And fresh products, surprisingly, are only 20 or 30, 40% maybe at most. And that is because there's lots of things in between the farm and the supermarket, much of which has to do with what we now call food waste. That is loss along the chain. You take those two percentages, and you could ask this question, which we've been asking: what if you improve the wages of farm workers? 50%. 50% would raise many farm worker families out of poverty. Certainly that would be true in most places in the Central Valley. Now you could do that by saying, we require that. The problem with that approach is that farmers would naturally say, gee, I have to compete, I'll mechanize more would move offshore, people would not grow the labor-intensive crops and move towards the land towards the less labor-intensive crops. Some of that's already happened. The other approach, and the one that I want to talk to you about for a minute, says let's take advantage of the food movement. Let's take advantage of people caring about their food and their source of their food. We see lots of labels on foods now. We've talked about brands a little while ago, and the success in Florida, having brand owners bring that back, that economic message back to the farm. So imagine everyone in this room and rooms like this one said to themselves, I would actually pay more for a brand that had right on the label, farm workers are paid more. someone here could come up with a good name. That's not my part of it. Call it worker equity, call it justice, something. But I think there are people willing to pay. Because what we're talking about, you take those two percentages I was talking about and multiply them together, you can increase farm worker wages by 50% with an increase in the price of that food item somewhere between 2 or 3%, many of them just 1%, up to 3 or 4 or 5%. And I think people are willing to pay for that if they got the message in the right way. And it may take brands to do it. It may take intermediate buyers. It may take somebody who gets the signal that this on the label will sell this food just as well as gluten-free or GMO-free or some other label might that catches people's eyes. I've done work, for example, on the prices of cage-free eggs. Cage-free egg production is not an ideal technology. Those of you that are familiar with how that's done, you wonder why that caught on. There are other technologies that are cheaper and probably better for the hens. But so the question here, I think we have a label that could really mean a lot to some very vulnerable people that need help. And I really think it's most important to do it, as an economist, I'd say, from the demand side as opposed to the supply side. Because the more we've tried to raise worker wages by simply demanding that farmers pay more, we really haven't solved the problem. And I'd like to see us move to the demand side and try to pull more revenue that must be dedicated to farm workers by the very nature of the labeling and the certification. So let me leave you with that. We could talk about environmental issues, climate change. I was up on a climate panel yesterday morning back in California in San Diego, where farmers and many others are trying to figure out how to do climate smart farming. That has labor implications as well. But let me leave it at that and go to Alice.
You said you were about economist money, and I'm all about taste. I'm all about pleasure. And when I went to France when I was 19, I fell in love with the slow food, if you will, culture of France in 1965. And I felt like I'd never really eaten anything before that time. And then I ate that wild strawberry, the hot baguette, the oyster right out of the water. I went to the farmer's market every day on my way to school. I actually didn't go to school. I was supposed to. But I went to another school, a school of culture and life. And it was so irresistible. And when I came back home, I said, I want to live like the French. And very happily, I was in Berkeley in the 60s. I went back to school in a very political place. And I heard the words of Mario Savio. And he said, we can change this world. And I just said, yes, we can. And when we stopped the war in Vietnam, I was very empowered. And I decided that I would open a restaurant because I felt like it would be a place that we could gather friends and talk about the politics of the day. And I would certainly be able to find good food if I had a restaurant, French food. I figured I would be able to find that, like the fancy French restaurants in San Francisco. Well, we had one menu a day. because I wanted it to feel like I was serving people at home, my house. And we were a group of non-professionals. So we didn't know how to access from big distributors. We didn't understand food that way. We were all home cooks. And if you will, sort of intellectual cookbook readers. But we had that passion for serving real food. And it took a while in that search to find the food that tasted good. And we ended up at the doorsteps of the local sustainable farmers in Northern California. We hired a forager to go to see the farmers and make a connection. Sometimes we brought them into the restaurant and we fed them. And we talked about what they could grow for us. And it was an amazing experience to have that, build that network. And their values came right through the kitchen door. At first, I was bringing seeds, and I was saying, plant these things. Plant these seeds that I got over in France. And now they're telling us what to cook. And they say, because it's really nutritious, and they're growing all over our farm, see whether you can make something good out of nettles. And so we made a nettle pizza. And it's the most successful pizza at the restaurant. Now, of course, nettles have a season, like everything else. And we follow that rigidly. So sometimes those little nettles get too big and tough. We can't use them. But when they're young in the spring, they're fantastic, and the second crop comes in the fall. But we follow the cycle of the farmers. And so this is what has empowered Chez Panisse for almost 48 years. And we have named the farmers and the ranchers who have been our co-producers. I use that word because that's a slow food relationship. That's a Carla Petrini term for how we work together. We're co-producers of our meal. And the growth of the farmers market movement in this country is something incredibly hopeful, especially the markets that are really dedicated to sustainability. I mean, I go rain or shine to that market. But we have one farmer, Bob Kennard, and he's taught us so much about health because he is taking all of our scraps from the restaurant. We take them up to his farm, and then we bring down the vegetables. And he believes that the soil is what brings the nutrition to the food. And he said his carrots were 10 times more nutritious than anybody else's. And I thought it was a joke. And come to have them analyzed, they are. Because he's allowing the soil to be all that it can be with every animal, and just he's building the soil. And of course, it's that regenerative agriculture that's addressing climate change. Directly, it's pulling the carbon right down into the earth. So,
That might be the first line of applause I've ever heard for regenerative agriculture ever.
Well, it's the easiest, from my point of view, way to address climate change. You could do it in your own backyard. You could do it on the roof of your house. You can make compost. But I was really worried at the restaurant about what was happening upstream. And having been a Montessori teacher way back, I believed in her method of teaching, the interactive method. And she believed that our senses are our pathways into our minds. And so when we're touching and smelling and tasting, listening and seeing, we are really experiencing the world in this rich way. And just as she worked with the very poor in Naples and in India a century ago, that she said were sensorially deprived because of hunger and poverty, that here in this country, many children are sensorially deprived, but from hunger and poverty, but most everyone because of the indoctrination of a fast food culture. So I used her principles and I married them with edible education and had the opportunity to build a school in Berkeley, a middle school, 1,000 kids, 27 different languages spoken at home. So it was a good test group for edible education. And we built a garden classroom, and we built a kitchen classroom, not to teach cooking and gardening per se, but to teach math and science and art and language. And what we did in the kitchen was we cooked the food of the culture that we were studying. And maybe it was the geography of the Arabian Peninsula. So we cooked tabbouleh salad, made hummus, and pita bread. And needless to say, the children felt empowered. And I always say it was 6 weeks to kale. So I tried to think, and now we're at the 25th year of the Edible Schoolyard Project, and it has grown around the world. The values of that project have been scaled, if you will. I hate to use that word. But in fact, to nearly 7,000 schools on our website, which anyone can visit and download the information about schools around the world, and many, many, many in this country. And so if you know any that haven't been entered into our website, please put them in there, edibleschoolyardproject.org. But what is really important, and I tried to think of a way that we could address climate change first, how we could nourish our children, how we could use our last truly democratic institution, the public school system, to educate the next generation and to support all of the farmers and ranchers who were taking care of the land and their farm workers for the future. So we've created a pledge. And I believe that we are poised in the state of California to make this happen. A free, sustainable school lunch for every single child, K through 12. K through 12. And it is my hope that by the 50th year of not only Diet for a Small Planet, but of Chez Panisse, that we will gather at the Capitol in Sacramento and hear the governor in the state of California announce this initiative. So we need all of your support, and you're welcome to join us there on the mall.
So Alice talked about thinking of the farmers as co-producers. Francis, you were talking about a worker who sort of felt like, why don't people who know they're getting their food from us care about us? I think often these conversations go between if you have just labor, well, that's going to impact profit, right? It's this or this. And the reason you go for profit, you just can't have them both in the same way. And if you're going to be ethical, well, then you're not going to be sustainable, right? There are these juxtapositions. I'd be curious for everybody on the panel, does it have to be that way? I mean, are there really good examples where you could say there are successes that don't kill your profit and still allow you to justly treat your workers? Who wants to start with that?
I just feel very
I
strong.
love that you're raising your hand. I recognize you.
Thank you. I'm in school. But I have to say that it's the biggest myth that fast food culture has perpetrated on in this country, is that organic food is too expensive. And the second myth is that we could never do it in the public schools. It's impossible.
But organic food is more expensive, right?
It is more expensive, but if you know how to cook, it can be equally inexpensive. I hate to talk about food as being cheap, because I want, and we always have since the beginning of time, paid so much more for our food, less for other things, but we want it. Food has been precious, and we have to think of it that way. We have to learn how to use the whole vegetable, how not to waste anything, how to cook from day to day, and to really, I would say, for an expensive organic chicken, I can make 3 meals. But Jose Andres says he can make 6.
Sounds like a throwdown. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
One example that really will always inspire me, and it's an example of it's not possible to know what's possible. And in my case, you have a little faith because I didn't expect it at all. But in 1988, I was sitting on a bench in some little church talking in western Wisconsin to some hardscrabble farmers who said, it's really tough here now. This was the 1980s, and we've even had farmer suicide, and we think we're going to start a cooperative. And I almost oh, how nice. You might help some of your buddies here in western Wisconsin. Well, some of you may know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Organic Valley. That started out in '88 with this handful of visionary farmers, and it now is I think $2 billion business, and 2,000 farmers and billion plus in sales all around the country. And I think it is and they've kept so true to their democratic principles in this cooperative and true to their organic principles. And so I just think this is a great example of, taking risks, and it's not possible to know what's possible.
So one thing that immediately comes to my mind when you ask that question is a moment, and it actually relates to the United Farm Workers. When I was running the Workplace Project, the immigrant center that I founded in the 90s, we had an organizing school with immigrant workers as part of the organization. And one thing we used to do is, for a class, we would show a video that the United Farm Workers had made on grapes and pesticides. And most of the video was about consumers and the danger to their health from pesticides. And there were these close-up shots of people trying to wash pesticides off their grapes and the illnesses pesticides caused. And the video would finish and we would have a conversation about, we didn't say up front who made the video, and we would have people guess. Immigrant workers would guess where that video came from, and they thought maybe a health organization or a consumer protection organization. And then we would say, no, it was the United Farm Workers. And the point was, we're all in this together, right? That was a video about workers' rights to not be killed by the food they pick. And if workers are being sickened and killed by the food they pick, so are we as consumers. And so I think that maybe it's nowhere so true as with food and food workers and food eaters, that what hurts when farm workers don't have water and shade and bathrooms, that impacts those of us who eat. When farm workers have to pick food that's laced with dangerous chemicals, that's the food we're eating. And to recognize that our fates are intertwined, we are the same people. Farm workers are also eaters. And therefore, the struggles are the same, is a very powerful and also very true message.
So is it sometimes a failure of framing? And Sara, maybe I'll have you answer this first. Because I would imagine if I went to a grocery store and talked to people about the pesticides on their apples, they'd be talking about the eaters. And maybe after 5 questions, they might be like, oh yeah, I guess people pick these. I don't know that people jump to the safety of the farm. I don't think people think about the farm workers. I think things show up in bags, neatly packaged, very nice, and they're fine with that. And I wonder, when you were talking about the beverage tax, part of that was a framing issue, right? Changing it from soda is bad, we're gonna tax it, to wouldn't it be great to have universal pre-K in this community? That worked, right?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question, you know, we have a luxury on this panel, and many of you in the room, to be thinking about food all the time. We have a luxury of going to fancy stores and buying really nice food that always looks nice and is not bruised and messed up. But for the average American, our pocketbooks are our primary concern. It is not health. And so, yes, in the back of our minds, we have a sense of, yes, we should eat healthy and that's important. But for the average person, that is not the fundamental concern when you're making food decisions. And so that really differentiates the thought process from maybe us on this panel and many of you in this room and the average low-income or middle-income American. And in the case of beverage taxes, all this is politics. And so many times to get public health issues to be successful, you cannot frame them as public health issues because, again, that is not the most fundamental issue that people often care about. And so in Philadelphia, the beverage tax, which has now proven to be so successful from a public health standpoint, failed twice before it passed. And it failed twice first because it was framed as, this is about taking sugary beverages out of our diet, the largest source of added sugar, they're increasing obesity and dental caries and so on, and it was a flop. And it was when the beverage tax shifted and said, you know what, this isn't just about sugary beverages, let's throw in diet soda, let's tax that too. And by the way, all the money we raise, we're gonna create pre-K slots for little kids in the city. And that is what pushed it over the line. And so I think the message in that is, sometimes to get to the outcome that you care about, you have to frame it in a different way.
Let me toss in something here.
I love that you guys are clapping after every single thing our panel says. And in my heart, I love it. But I'm going to ask you to hold till the end because we have so much to cover and not a whole lot of time, if that's okay. Go ahead.
I want to, and I'm really glad you brought up the idea of families just trying to get by every week, because I think that is important. And I mentioned farm worker families earlier in that context, but it's broader than that. But it's also the way we frame pretty much every story about agriculture, it seems. I got a lot of media calls over the last week or so asking me about the consequences of a spring rain we had in California. We had an odd rain in May up and down the Central Valley where lots of things are grown. And they asked me about cherries, and they said, what about cherry prices? And you can picture it. And in every one of those interviews, I had to say, you know, the farmers, sure, they lost their cherry crop. Frankly, farmers are generally rich. They're wealthy people. And in fact, they built in the idea that they lose a cherry crop now and again. But the farm workers that harvest that cherry crop, I was talking to one of my students just a couple of days ago. His folks had lost a month of work in the Bakersfield area, the Fresno Bakersfield area. They were getting ready to go up to Lodi to see if they could harvest cherries there too, but that crop had been wiped out too. So here we have a family that's just on the edge, really on the edge, and they lose work for a month. It's badly paid work, but it's the only work they had. And I think getting that into the food stories is just really crucial. And I say it to you because you're our
I am so guilty as charged in that, because I'm thinking of the soybean stories we've done, as we've done many stories on the tariffs, et cetera, and I was like, I have not yet asked about a single farm worker's impact. And I have talked about farmers and crops and tariffs and not being able to build out their farms or get loans. That is a really, really great point, and I think it needs to be changed in everybody's narrative about this issue. They're left out of the conversation altogether. I think that's a really good point.
But what if we had school-supported agriculture? Just like we have community-supported agriculture. What if schools really bought directly from the people who are doing that work? So the money goes to them instead of the middleman. And that's so important, because once you make those connections, you see people as, you know, you work with them to figure out how to overcome the difficulties of farming. And we're going to have many, many problems because of climate. And we have to figure out what to plant, and we have to figure out how to cook that. Why aren't we having millet planted? Because that's so drought resistant. And everybody is talking about how millet used to be the staple crop of India. And then wheat came in because it was sort of sold to India. But millet is so nutritious and so drought resistant. Excuse me. So I think it's the schools and the universities, I dare say, that have the buying power to make this change.
You had mentioned sort of this idea of feeling in the 60s that you could sort of wake up America. And I remember as a kid walking, you know, to grocery stores and people picketing and saying, don't buy grapes, don't buy grapes. I remember them so clearly as a child. Could that exist today? Could that truly exist, that same sense of effectiveness in a boycott? With social media, would that help? Or with social media, would it hurt? Or is there just so much information coming out? Could we recreate a similar thing? You said, you know, what could happen? Could there be a revolution? Could you wake up America? Can you?
In a sustainable way, because you don't just want a flash, right? You don't just want the news event. You want to change things in a fundamental way, in a long-lasting way. That's tougher.
Yes.
We must.
So I'm struggling here in part because I'm thinking, oh wait, but that's kind of happening, and realizing that I'm on a stage with people who know about things that are happening, and so it's clearly not reaching the threshold of the popular imagination, right? Because even just to go back to the story I told about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, they have mobilized, and using social media and networks of students and religious organizations, brought people together to boycott and to demand that stores buy tomatoes in this program. And in fact, in response to something Dan said, they have a sticker called the Fair Food Program, and it goes on the tomatoes. But it is true that it hasn't reached mass public awareness. It may be enough to move Walmart, but it's not the experience that I think many of us had in the room of everybody knew about grapes in the 60s and the farm workers, right? And that, I think, that level is what we haven't had yet, but it could happen. I'm an optimist as well as a possibilist.
Every day we have an opportunity to buy food. And we can buy food from the people who are really destroying our food system, or we can buy food from the people who are taking care.
But I would say your average person finishes their job. They run into the store. They've got their kid under one arm and the cart with the other arm, and they are throwing stuff into their basket as fast as possible because they need to get out of the store within 10 minutes so they can pick up the other kid, get across town, and sometimes go start their second job. Sometimes they get to start dinner and feed their family. Like, the reality can really be challenging.
Yeah, but I understand that belief. Yeah, I understand that difficulty when 1 in 2 people is divorced in this country. Nobody ever talks about that. Where are the children? Do you know most children in this country don't have 1 meal with the family? Not 1 meal. Maybe as many as 85%, I have heard. Many people eat in the car. But these are all values that the fast food industry is feeding us.
So I think one thing I think is really important in all these food conversations is to remember that we can't sort of throw everything up in the air and expect it all to change tomorrow.
Exactly.
That you have to meet people where they are. And for a lot of people, they want to do the right thing, but they simply lack resources. So let's think again about the 40 or so million Americans that are on food stamps. The average amount of money you get on that program is $261 a month. Some of us are going to go to dinner tonight and spend more than that on dinner. And so, you know, what that program assumes is that you are soaking your beans and you're cutting up raw vegetables. It does not account for the time costs of making food. And it takes a huge amount of time to go to the grocery store, to prepare the meals. And I think that it's an undue burden to put on middle-income and low-income families to sort of expect all these shifts that are simply not realistic. But if we think about the fact that half of our food dollars are spent outside the home, how can we change the restaurant environment? How can we change different places that we eat to make eating healthy much, much more easy, as opposed to asking people to make changes, which frankly, I don't think are realistic.
And I would say,
To begin in kindergarten.
But why don't you respond to that, and then I'll have you jump in. Go ahead.
We have to begin in kindergarten. We have to begin with kids that are open and learning. And imagine for a family to have 3 kids in schools that you don't have to worry about whether they have a good breakfast, lunch, and an afternoon snack. They are going to eat for free. New York City has already done a free food in schools program. They want to make it nutritious. They need to connect with the farmers that are in and around New York to make that happen. But they've already done that, free school lunch. Now we know that when the kids get educated around food, they bring that home to their family. It's what's happened at the Edible Schoolyard. Some of the kids want to even plant gardens at their house in window boxes because of the experience that they've had at school. That's how we educated everyone about smoking, was in school. And the universities have this beautiful population of young people. And they could edibly educate them by feeding all the students. a free meal that's part of the tuition. I mean, I worked at Yale for actually longer than 4 years, and we made a garden there, and we tried to change the buying practices. We began, but we didn't write the mission down in cement. And so it didn't go from one food service director to the next, but in schools that have all the money in the world to do this, they're not doing it.
Jennifer.
So I want to love two children, but slightly different children than Frankie, and that is food and economic justice, right? I think we've got to take a step back and ask, why is it, as Soledad said, that there's the 2 jobs and the running around and the no time? It's because of the economic system in which which dictates most people's work and means that they're getting very low wages. They have to work 2 and sometimes 3 jobs to survive. Even then, they don't have the money to buy good food at the currently available level, much less the time to cook it. And so I think a discussion about food and people's access to food has to be set within a larger understanding of what's happened to work in this country for most workers who earn a low wage.
So you're framing it as a food justice issue, right? The ultimate question, right? Is eating healthily sort of a justice issue? And on the other side of that, and I think framed politically, is, well, listen, if you're an individual, you have rights, and if you want to eat terrible food all day, well, that is your God-given American right to go. You want to chug a case of soda every day, basically that's in the Constitution, go for it, sister. I mean, that's sort of the political argument for it.
By the way, that's also true in France.
Now, yes.
I just want to jump in here and totally support what you're saying. I see this in the what I call living democracy frame, that why was it that we had from the 40s to the 70s that we were all gaining, all classes of society, and the poor gained the most, and then that reversed. That is a set of political, the frame of politics changed. Government suddenly, we were told the government was the enemy, and the role of money in politics just absolutely inserted itself, and now I just read recently that there are more agribusiness lobbyists than there are fossil fuel lobbyists. So I just want to embed your plea, which I totally agree with, for economic justice in the framework of real democracy, because that is a pathway that's so important. I also wanted to ask a question about a couple decades ago, there was a fair trade movement that I thought was really taking off, and labels were put on and they had to do with worker conditions, and you knew that if you were buying fair trade. And as it worked out, when I looked at it from the position or the point of view of the global south, that many growers, like I remember cocoa farmers in Ghana, were doing a lot better because there was a standard that they had to be paid well in order to be fair trade. So do any of you know why we're not talking about that movement anymore?
Was there an economic value? I mean, sometimes those things collapse because the economics don't work out of it. What happened to it, Daniel? Not to put you on the spot, but I will.
Certainly, any campus, I suspect this one as well, if you want to get a cup of coffee, it will be a fair trade cup of coffee. And that's true for not the poor and middle class coffee, it's for the upper end coffee, and it's still true. Now, whether you have the appropriate traceability all the way back to the farm is really questionable, and lots of colleagues have tried to follow that through, and the answer is very mixed. In terms of the economic well-being of the growers, it's a very mixed story. And cocoa in particular is produced by the poorest people in the world, not in Ghana, where they're relatively wealthy, as a matter of fact, but places where they're much poorer. And there's a place where I think the companies involved, the big cocoa companies, chocolate companies, recognize their vulnerability, and those companies are panicked because of that situation. They know that's not really sustainable.
But I do think that it's important to put sort of information type interventions in the context of, will they actually make a difference? So we know from pick your public health issue that information is great, but it is not sufficient to change things in the long term.
What
And
is
so,
sufficient?
So you need blunt policy instruments which change our environments.
Yes.
So for example, like beverage taxes is a good one. Changes to big federal programs are another good one. Increasing wages is another good one. But basically creating longer maternity leaves is another good one. But relying on you and me and others to make personal decisions, it is simply not sustainable. We are, by definition, very, very resistant to behavior changes. We will maybe do things for a little while, but then we'll stop. And that is telling, because we have a $70 billion diet industry, because people are constantly falling off the wagon and trying new things, because we as individuals cannot do this ourselves. And there's this sort of mountain of influences coming down from the food system that we cannot fight on our own. And so you have to change the broader environment.
I absolutely agree we do have to change the policies. But I just know that when I read a label, I'm not sure who is doing the certification for organic in China, for instance, for Whole Foods. Is that one of the people from Whole Foods that's been validating that? I don't know. I mean, what is fresh these days when you're talking about shipping and 2 weeks old? You know, what is cage-free? Is that 2 feet or is that a yard? What is, you know, what do those terms mean? Most of them have been hijacked by the fast food industry, and we don't know, really. And it's always hidden under the flap. And so I think that's the best case for buying locally and knowing who your farmers are and meeting with them, really knowing them. And I think it would be fantastic if a university took this on as a whole, like this one.
I know one that might be able to do it.
But to really to do this, to really decide to buy the food differently. I know that I've gone down this path with so many universities, and I'm pressing madly on the doors of the University of California. The only one that has opened up is Davis. And I'm very, very hopeful because they're creating a sustainable campus in the middle of Sacramento. And they want really to take this seriously. The head of food service is amazing. And he is buying all the food from local people.
So then let's talk about that hope as we wrap up our panel. And I'm going to, Frances, have you do our last word, because you said something that I had never ever heard, and I've been on 1 million panels, and you said, don't be an optimist. I've never actually heard anyone say that. You don't have to be an optimist. Usually on panels, someone's like, be an optimist. You say you should be a possibilist. I have to work that out. So why should we be possibilityists?
How about a probabilist?
A probabilist. You might have a challenge from our economist.
If you can achieve optimism, good for you. But I'm saying to do what we've got to do, all we have to do is believe that it's not possible to know what's possible. It is so freeing for me that I don't have to weigh the odds. I just have to know, it might be possible. And that's the place we are right now. And the last thing that we need is despair. Despair is our greatest enemy, so it is not too late to be a possibilist. That's my...
And it's an excellent way to end our panel. Our final word. We're over time and they're going to kill me. But I want to thank all of you today for your words. We're going to take a short break now, and on the other side, we'll have the opportunity to talk to Dolores Huerta. Thank you, guys.